Hi, my name is Kai Balin, and this is Still Seeking.
I was born to two parents who had converted. I was actually already conceived in the womb while my mother was going through the final process of her conversion into Judaism. In a short order, we found our way into the Baltimore Jewish community, which is a very Orthodox Jewish community. We lived in that. Grew up in that community. I knew nothing else besides Orthodox Judaism. I knew that Reform and Conservative existed, but they were mostly like a punchline. I had no idea what they believed or what they thought. I just knew Orthodoxy was right, Judaism was right. All these other religions were doing their best, but we were right. I had no doubt about that. That doesn't mean I lived up to all the what you're supposed to do, all the halachot, all the laws you're supposed to follow. I didn't do that. I was like a kid and wanting to be cool and wanting to fit in and wanting to be popular. And so a lot of it I did not do until so it went up through my teens, and I was not really, I was keeping things, not keeping things, but I always knew I was doing the wrong thing. There was no question in terms of my faith that what God wanted from me. It was just hard to do as a teenager. And then in about 10th grade, I did what's called in the Jewish community, Orthodox Jewish community, flipping out. It's when you kind of like catch fire. It becomes a little ridiculous because you're usually a young person, and so you suddenly think you have all the answers and you know the way, and you start to tell everyone what they need to do. But I flipped out. I immediately got a black hat. I started growing out my peyote. I was all excited. I was learning as much as I could. I was learning as much Torah as I could. I would spend all day doing it. And this stayed for a couple of years. I went to a different yeshiva that was like a full-on post-high school yeshiva that I could spend all day doing it. And this seemed like this was going to be my trajectory of life. And I was even starting to look to get married and move to Lakewood, New Jersey, which is like the hub of Orthodox Yeshivish Judaism in America. But I went through a sort of crisis of selfhood. I found that I was wearing this black hat and I had done, this whole sort of transformation of self, and yet it didn't quite feel right. Something felt off about it. Something felt like I was having to be a little bit fake. It wasn't quite who I wanted to be. And so this was not the first time, and it won't be the last time, that I was like, okay, I'm going to leave yeshiva. I'm going to try to just go back and figure out who I really am under all of this uniform and costumery that I'd put on. So I left the yeshiva. I ended up going to Israel and joining my family who had already moved there. And then living in Israel for a bunch of years, I started to take on more of a dati le'umi, like a national religious Jewish identity. So still very much a believer in God and Judaism and Jewish life, but now in a much different exterior. So not so much the black and white, more of like the kippah sruga. But ultimately, the foundation of it was basically the same. And I joined the army in Israel, into the paratroopers. And at the time, I had a very close friend of mine, still a very close friend of mine, who had started to doubt Judaism from the core tenets. Now, I've always had a philosophical bent, so I had no problem talking about philosophical ideas and philosophical ideas regarding God, and I had read certain books that had already started to play around with those concepts, but I had never doubted Judaism, and I'll get back to what it means, the distinction I have around doubt and a question. But Moshe started to really doubt Judaism, and we would spend, every time we were hanging out together, we would be debating. We would debate Judaism, his arguments against God, his arguments against Judaism, and I would spend hours with him debating. And I wasn't moving him, but I kept praying to God that he would see what I already saw very clearly. And I would spend, and then because I was in the army at the time, one of the things we had to do was go on guard duty for hours at a time. And so for those hours, I would spend my whole time arguing him in my head. I would like pace around and just be debating his questions, and I would think of an answer, and then I would try to think, what would he think? What would he say to that answer? And this went on and on and on, back and forth, until eventually I had my first doubt. And this is where I'll make that distinction, which is you can question anything you want in the world. And it's an intellectual exercise, and it may be very useful, and it may be very intense, but it's an intellectual exercise. A doubt is an emotional, visceral experience. My quick example of this is if you can question whether or not your parents are your biological parents. But if you ever doubt that your parents are your biological parents, you're now going to Ancestry.com, you're getting your DNA tested. Your life is like stops, it halts until this doubt can be rectified. And so that was the type of doubt I had. And it wasn't anything profound. It wasn't like some great question no one's ever asked before. It's a question that a 5-year-old could ask. The question, as it formulated in my head, was, how do I know I'm right? Like, ultimately, after all these things, I've been questioning, I've been thinking, I've been discussing this with Moshe, my friend, and we've been going back and forth, but it was like, it hit me like, it's where it's like, it's almost not in the mind, not in the head. It was like a bodily shot. Like, ultimately, how do I know that I'm right? Like, I could have been born to different parents. I could have had a different set of, presuppositions. So, and I would have ended up somewhere else. There's no reason to think I wouldn't have ended up in a different religion. And that was it was a devastating blow. And from then, my whole life halted. At this point, I was already married to my wife. We were already living a fully Jewish life, but I knew I couldn't just continue. There was no way to turn this off. Once I had this doubt, it was like, I have to solve this one way or another. And this led into what became a really excruciating process of questioning my faith from a very realistic level, like, this might actually be wrong. All these other times I had questions about this, I had no doubt that I was going to end up with the conclusion I already had. But now it was like, it was really open. It was a really open question. And I jumped on, do what I always do. I grabbed a bunch of books. I jumped online. There was, at that point, it was the era of like the new atheists, and the internet was just filled with debates between religious thinkers and atheist thinkers. And at the time, as I watched all of these atheist thinkers debate these religious thinkers, it was like, they seem to be way more intelligent and have their stuff way more together and know way more about philosophy and be following scientific research and have this really openness to evidence. And the religious people felt to me like they had their conclusion, they were defending their conclusion, but they weren't willing to really investigate it. And so slowly my faith was chipped away at until basically I remember the morning I was strapping on my tefillin, which men do after the age 13 for the morning prayers. And I was like, I felt like a robot. I felt like I was just doing something. My mind was like, I don't believe in this. I don't buy it, but I'm doing it out of habit. And I felt that was the worst way. That was like that's always been my biggest fear, is I don't want to be someone who just lives out of habit, because that's because that's where like everything is flowing in that direction. Just keep on going with it. It was like, if I don't buy this, then I'm not going to do it. And the following day, I'm pretty sure it was the following day, I missed the time to put on tefillin. And I remember this, and I write about this in the book back here behind me. But I had this moment where I was watching the sunset happen in Jerusalem. And once the sun set, the time for putting on tefillin is past. It's over. You can't wear it for that day. And I like watched the sun slowly settle. And in my stomach, I was feeling this, like, maybe I should just go run to a Chabad stand in Jerusalem and just quickly put it on, just to like get it in, because I was feeling the guilt and all the stuff that was coming up. But I like defiantly made a decision. I'm like, no, I'm going to stick with this. This is what I believe. This is the right thing. This is why I'm going to follow what I think is true. And the sun set. And with that, it was like a new chapter. It was like entering into a whole new space of my life. And, and then it continued on from there. My journey didn't stop. It was a lot of battling. It was a lot of thinking through problems over and over again. It was a lot of writing letters to rabbis to try to get responses from them. It was reading books I could get my hand on and writing. I was doing a ton of writing then. I couldn't stop writing. I was writing this blog at the time, just blogging each thing I had to come to my mind. I would, write it out. And my atheist journey, such as it was, went on for about 8 years. And it went through all the different seasons. It went through where I became really contemptuous of religious life, where it was just it looked like stupid nonsense that people were engaged in. And then I went through periods of just indifference to it. And then I would go through periods where I felt challenged by it again and would need to like smother those challenges. And finally it went to a place I think I got to towards the end, which was like a peace with it. I felt okay with it. I could see the beauty in it again. But I was very much like, this isn't for me. It just didn't speak to me, but, great for other people who have it. That was kind of like what I went through. Obviously, day to day, those emotions could shift. But overall, I would say that was the overall trajectory of like my atheism. And then a weird thing happened that is what I'm going to do the best I can to explain it. But it's it's utterly mundane and utterly miraculous. That's how I think about it. But I sat down to read a book by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. I had gotten this book as a wedding present. I had not touched it for about a decade, a little less than a decade. And I decided to pick it up because I was doing at that time, I was reading with my morning coffee. I wasn't praying. So I was trying to find something as a morning routine, and I had been reading different books, and this one had been sitting on my shelf staring at me for years. And so I figured, okay, I'll read it as sort of an intellectual exercise. Like, I don't believe in what he's going to say, but let me read someone who I know is wise and thoughtful. And this way I can like sharpen my intellectual ideas. And as I opened the first page of the book and started reading, he asks a question on that first page, which is basically summarized to, why do humans have a capacity for awe and wonder? And why, if someone does not have that capacity, we look at that as inhuman? That's the basic question. And he goes off to push his ideas from that starting point of, what this capacity speaks to something about us that might be more than animalistic or natural. And the question is a good question, and the book is fantastic and well worth a read. But what happened to me in that moment is the reverse of what happened to me prior. It was a doubt suddenly entered into my atheism. And it felt like for a moment my mind was cracked open and I got to see something incredible, and then it closed. And again, I don't want to make it sound more than it was. I didn't see any visions. Nothing happened that was, could be really described. But what happened to me on an emotional level was, again, I'm suddenly back to this place of saying, oh, maybe there is more to the universe than I was giving it credit for. Maybe there's something beyond what my rational mind can understand. And it's a little bit hard to explain because, again, that doesn't sound like it's overly, it's not like that question is unanswerable. If you pose that question to any of the new atheists, they would talk about an evolutionary byproduct of curiosity, and curiosity led more to survival. All different types of answers you can postulate to that question. It's not a knockdown question. But it had an experience. I had an experience through that question that I have since translated as an experience of God, like opening up my eyes. Like there's, the scales falling from my eyes and me seeing first like, well, okay, there is something more. And that kind of quickly, it started to roll very quickly after that. In like almost an amazing sense. I moved from, okay, there seems to be a God, that God seems to communicate with us, because I feel like I was just communicated with in some capacity. So it can't be like I'm not talking about some deist first cause here that just started the world and is not involved anymore. This is a God of history. This is a God, or what we can call like the Abrahamic religious God. And that was deeply impactful because it lowered my, what should I search out to only a few religions that really looked interesting. And so I immediately, obviously, my family, this whole time that I've been atheist, we've been living a Jewish life. My wife retained her faith in Judaism. We were keeping Shabbat in the home and kashrut. Our family was a Jewish family. My kids all went to Jewish schools. So that was the easiest way to go back to. So I quickly went back to that. I went back to shul one morning, went back to synagogue and put back on my tefillin and started to pray and, looked around me and it felt very empty. The prayers of the people there were all, guys getting ready for work, and it felt like, let's just get through this as soon as we can. And I had just this experience where I'm like, God is real and we got to attach to this God. And it was like, I came to a house of worship and it felt like zero worship was happening. And I remember feeling like I wanted to just yell in the middle, let's just pretend we believe in God for a few minutes, as opposed to just muttering these words in haste. So I kind of got sickened with that, went home and said, okay, I'll pray from home. But even there, the prayers felt very stale to me. And I was kind of like, this is not fitting for me. And kind of by happenstance, I looked at one of the podcasts I had been interested in. I kind of searched its archives for anything I could find about religion, because now I'm interested in eating up stuff about religion. Before I would have skipped over those podcasts. Now I'm like, I want to listen to those. And I found a podcast where the interviewee was a guy named Robert Barron, who's a Catholic bishop. And I listened to him speak in that podcast and I was hooked. everything he was saying was what I was looking for. It was a theology of love. It was a philosophy that seemed grounded in rationalistic thought and science, but also sat on top of that. It didn't seem to be mired in minutia of law. It felt like it was open and spiritual and God-driven. And Bishop Robert Barron is a brilliant man and really well-spoken and very interesting to listen to. I still listen to him today. I got hooked on him, and luckily for me, he had a podcast that he is a weekly podcast. So I jumped on that, subscribed, and I was listening to every day. I mean, he put out once a week, but I was every day listening to the backlog, just going through his podcast, just eating this up and finding myself suddenly drawn more and more to Catholicism. Now, I'm a Jewish kid who grew up in a Jewish community, has no understanding of Christianity, even though my parents had both converted from it. I had such a cursory understanding that I didn't even understand all the divisions within Christianity. I had no clue Catholic, this, I didn't know anything of that. But I'm starting to learn about it very quickly. And this is obviously very weird. My entire world is Jewish. We're living in Israel. Everything about my life is Jewish. And here I am inching towards converting to Catholicism, which is not looked well upon by a lot of the Jewish community. So I know I'm taking on this, but in some sense that the feeling of danger was drawing me even more towards it. It was like, yeah, this is the path of truth. This is difficult. It's going to be hard. I have to sacrifice. So it was feeling almost like I was being drawn to this. And I kept praying to God. At this point, I had already developed a prayer routine, but I kept praying to God the same thing. Like, God, if you want me to go this way, I will go this way. But it's going to cause a division in my family. It's going to cause a lot of headaches. I might be doing the wrong thing. So you need to you got to guide me here. And that was like my everyday prayer. And there were moments where I really felt guided by God. And at one point I did a little pilgrimage from my house in Modi'in to Jerusalem. And for the first time, I actually went into the Christian quarter in Jerusalem and sought out the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's the first church I'd ever been to in my life. And that's where the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, where they say Jesus was buried, but also where he was crucified. The whole area is now this church. And I walk in and I literally prayed this prayer to God. Okay, God, I'm a Jewish kid who has no clue what he's doing here. I don't know where I'm supposed to go, or who I'm supposed to meet, or what I'm supposed to see. You got to guide my feet here. And I just went down and sat on a wooden bench somewhere, and I'm watching these tourists come around, and there's big lines outside of certain things. I'm like, I don't know what that place is. I don't know what they're commemorating there. I had no idea. And so I just sat there, and at one point I saw an open room open in the back of this massive church filled with tourists. I figured I'm gonna go get some private time, just sit in quiet. And I went and sat in this room, and almost immediately as I sat down in one of the pews in this quiet, empty room, a whole tourist group came shuffling in to it. So the room becomes packed with, as it turns out, Catholics and me sitting in the corner. And I'm watching, I inadvertently had stepped into my first mass. And I'm watching this whole display happen. And I had already been, because of all the podcasts I listened to and books I had now read about Catholicism, I was already somewhat familiar with what was happening, but this was all very, very new to me. But I was kind of like, okay, God, you put me in this room. You kind of guided my feet here. Do you want me to see this? Okay, cool. And I made some friends of the people that were sitting next to me. They were obviously very enchanted by my story. They started to show me around of what this whole place was. I kind of went around it, prayed where I could. It was feeling, it felt very awkward, very strange, but I was like, okay, this is what I got to do. And so I kept going on this path, and it moved along. And at this point, we, for not reasons that are connected to this, my whole family moved from Israel to America. And in America, I started to attend, here in Nashville, we started to attend a church here. I did. My family's still keeping the Jewish, so we're part of these two communities. I'm just like shooting off on Sunday morning by myself to go to Mass. And I start, through Catholicism, I start the process called RCIA, which is the Rite of Christian Initiation for adults. It's basically the conversion process. It's a series of classes that culminates in, confirmation into the faith. And I started going to these on Tuesday nights, and I was loving them. They were, for me, what was so exciting was there's a bunch of people coming together, sitting around tables, discussing God, discussing faith, discussing our challenges with faith. and questioning and talking about our stories. And so I was loving it from the perspective of I can sit around and talk about faith in God and these questions and philosophical questions regarding religion for hours. This is like, I love to do this. So this was just a really fun experience, but I kept praying that God, if you don't want me on this train, you're going to have to throw me off, because this is looking good. It is, it's not the easiest path that I could have chosen, but it's feeling good. Theologically, it's working for me. I'm liking what I'm hearing. There's stuff I have a lot of issues with, but I'm working through those, as you have with any religion. And I felt like, okay, I'm going to probably convert. And I think a part of me also was a little tired of the being in this liminal space. I wanted to grab something and live by it. I wanted to take a religion, and even I'm like, I can't explain every part of it. I just want to live according to a religious faith. So I was sort of pushing towards that, and it looked like that's what was going to happen. And then October 7th happened. And October 7th, we were going to our synagogue here in Nashville. And, that's when we heard about the event that had occurred. And it was occurring on that day. So the information was very scattered. But because I had served in the Israeli army, and we had moved to America only recently, I knew that I could still get into my reserve unit. So I went home, called my parents, made sure they were okay, called my brother. He's already on base. He gave me kind of the breakdown as much as he could of what was going on. And then I called my unit, my contact person for my unit, and said, do you guys need me? And they said, come if you want to. And so the next day I got on a plane, October 8th, and was on a plane to Israel. Now, one of the things I did as I walked out the door, which just shows how I was in this very weird, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of situation. It's like two-part personality. As I grabbed someone had given us a keychain of Tfilat HaDerech, which is like the Wayfarer's prayer. It's a prayer you say when you're traveling distances. So I took that, and I took my rosary beads. And that goes into my bag. So that's like where I was at, like 1 foot in each one of these worlds. And I fly back to Israel. I joined my unit. And at the beginning, this was just kind of like, that I continued to pray the rosary. I continued to think about my Catholic thoughts and the questions I was having around Catholicism. I was reaching out to the church back here with questions I had, asking them for guidance on, different philosophical issues I had with Christianity. And that looked like, again, it didn't look like, even with this massive upset to the routine or the pattern I was moving towards, it wasn't like an immediate, I'll drop this and, go back to Judaism. It was like, this is non-contradictory. And after a while of both training, and then they had us kind of waiting in the rear guard for a while in central Israel, trying to figure out which way the war was going to go, if it was going to just be a southern war, it was going to south and north together. So a lot of uncertainty during those months. And then at some point, we went into Gaza, and we were in Gaza for like a period of a month and a half, all told, something like 40 plus days. But one of the things, and this is what's funny, because, people have all different conceptions of what a war zone would look like. And it happens to be where I was, there actually was a lot of quiet. There were moments of terror, and there were moments that were very loud, and there was constant explosions, but that falls into the background at some point. But there was also a lot of time to think. And the army had taken our phones because they didn't want, the enemy to use our GPS location to find out where we were. So they had taken our phones. So we're without a phone. We're living in houses that are, blown out. We're trying to fortify them and, do our missions. And we're doing guard duty again. So here I am on guard duty. I have 3 hours at a time of just time to think. Nothing to distract me. And it was during this period of thinking, along with, they gave me this little Hebrew book called Lama Ani Yehudi, Why Am I a Jew? It's an excerpt from one of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks's books. And I read that along with doing this, like, a ton of thinking, because I was struggling a lot with both, one thing that was very salient for me was someone asked me, like, David, why did you come back? Like, one of my fellow guys asked me, why did you come back? And at first, I didn't really have a good answer, because since I had become an atheist and my parents had converted to Judaism, my connection to Judaism had been severed. I didn't really feel very Jewish in any particular sense. It's not like I have a long line of Jews, although mother's father was Jewish. We had very little connection with him growing up. So I just had no feeling. I felt like an American. And I didn't think I felt very Jewish. And if you asked me at any point during those times, are you Jewish? I would hesitate to say yes. I might say yes only to clear things up and make things simple, but I didn't feel like a yes. So when he asked me that question, I gave him kind of what turned out to be a really lame answer, but it was the best I could come up with at the time, which was like, well, if there's going to be a fight and I can do something about it and people are being hurt, I'm going to jump in and help. Kind of like I'm going to go where the bully is. And, that felt good, except it wasn't long before my own brain presented me with the problem, well, you didn't fly to Ukraine when Russia attacked Ukraine. Not only did I not fly there, I had no inclination to fly there. And yet, when Israel was attacked, it was October 8th and I was on a plane. And so I had to kind of realize that as much as I had intellectually tried to remove my Jewish identity, at a core instinctual level, that Jewish identity that need to protect my people was there. So that was part of it. I also, through discussions I was having with fellow soldiers about my spiritual journey, I had one soldier with whom I was having this discussion, and just to set the scene, we were both on guard duty at the time, and so had to speak in a whisper so we couldn't be detected. And yet, of course, we're having this like high-level philosophical conversation. So it's just a funny scene to have that in. But at one point, I was telling him that what was drawing me to Christianity was the fact that instead of being focused on all these minutiae of law, Christianity was focused on loving the neighbor and loving the widow and orphan and taking care of the homeless. And that felt to me like religious at its highest level, not religion that focuses on, details that distract from those bigger themes. And as an example, I brought up the Hebrew prophets. And I even challenged him and said, I think Judaism's gone off the rails because the Hebrew prophets have said this, and all of them basically say the same thing, where God, I don't care about your Shabbatot and your Rosh Chodeshim, I don't care about your new moons and your Sabbaths. I want you to take care of the widow and orphan. And he kind of pointed out my own internal contradiction. He said, well, you're quoting Jewish prophets. Like, you can't say that's not Judaism, and then here are Jewish prophets saying those things. It's like, what do you mean? And so I had to struggle with that contradiction that I was feeling. And I remember at one point doing guard duty that I just had the realization, I'm like, I think I felt a deep surge towards Judaism, and I made this commitment that I'm like, okay, I'm going to give Judaism another try. I think this was all of this, and I the way I understood it was God understood that I couldn't go through Judaism through the front door. There was too much baggage there from my youth and from leaving it and all the stuff that I had, all the negative connotations I had. But there was this back door I could go into, and I fell in love. The thing I loved most about Christianity, as it turned out, was found in the Hebrew prophets. So I didn't have to leave Judaism in order to attach to those themes that I loved. And I entered sort of in this background way back into a commitment to Jewish practice. Now that's like nothing in my story. It wasn't a one day and then we're back in. It was a very slow evolution that still continues today. But once I got back from my deployment, it was, okay, I'm recommitted to a Jewish life, and I'm going to look at this and see what I really feel. And it was at that point that I started putting together a lot of poetry about this journey. Now, I'd already been writing, as I said, I'd been writing this whole journey out, because writing is how I process things. But I started to really write at this period of time, because as I got back, I was still very much, now all my world was up in chaos. I'd committed to a Jewish practice, but did I have all the Jewish beliefs? Did I think Judaism was true in any ultimate sense? And so I struggled a lot with that thinking. And again, that's just another 6 hours that I can do on just how I think about religions and truth claims and historical truths versus theological truths, and etc. But where I am now, as I find myself, I'm very happily committed to a Jewish life. I think I've found in Judaism, I've rediscovered in Judaism all the things that drew me to Christianity initially, I have in Judaism. And ultimately, while I have enormous respect for Christianity and Christian theology, there are too many issues I have with it from lots of different levels, both philosophical and emotional, that I'm not drawn to it anymore. But I do give it thanks, because it was through it that I was able to rekindle my relationship with Judaism. And it's been an incredible journey sort of along and seen a journey back to Judaism, but I'm so happy I went through it, because the Judaism that I am in today is very different than the Judaism I left, because I'm an entirely different person. I've come from a much more mature perspective. People hear my whole journey and they hear this, I'm running here, I'm going there, I'm changing this, I'm changing that. And they're like, okay, but you were married and you had kids. How did that function? And I like to say that Tova, my wife, is the hero of the story. Early on in my atheist journey, when I was giving up faith in God, I never hid anything from her. She saw me go out and buy The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins and End of Faith by Sam Harris. She saw these books. She knew what I was reading. I was constantly engaging her with challenges I was finding in faith, contradictions that I couldn't resolve. And we would discuss them and debate them. And then she would go on her life. And I would sit and try to think through what she said and prepare my next attack. But she wasn't doing anything different. She was still happy and loving, and we were having a great time, and our marriage was still moving on, and we were getting ready to have a kid. And I was like, does she not get it? Does she think this is like some fad that's going to pass over, or some intellectual exercise that doesn't have any, I'm giving up faith. I'm not going to live a Jewish life. Why isn't she doing what I would have done in that situation if the roles were reversed? I'm a little bit ashamed to say, but I think I would have been going to rabbis and saying how can I fix these doubts? I'd be buying her books to try to convince her. I'd be frantically trying to change her mind. And she felt you're doing your thing. It's great. And I just really felt like she wasn't getting it. So I remember I took her for a walk, and we're walking and talking about things. And I'm in my head, I'm not listening to her at all. I'm just preparing, how do I bring this conversation up to her? And at some point I just interrupted whatever it was she was saying and just said, do you realize this is real? And that's all I remember saying. I don't know if I gave more context. My memory is that she sort of just immediately understood what was happening, what I was talking about. But who knows? Memory does that, where it just condenses stories. Either way, when it was clear to her what I was talking about, however that happened, she said, I'm not bothered at all. I married a man of truth, and you continue to be a man of truth. And it was that was it for her. So for all of my issues, I was taking off my kippah. That was a big deal. I used to wear a black hat. Now that's a big deal. She saw that as all external and superficial. And it's not that uniforms aren't important, and that's a different conversation, but she saw all of that as superficial. What she saw, even more than I could see, was at the core, what I was trying to do was sincerely pursue what I found was true. And for her, that's what she attracted to her to me originally, was here's a guy who takes his faith very seriously. At the time, that was some of my criteria for the wife I wanted to marry, was that she had to want to live a religious life and that she wanted to live in Israel, which is ironic because I left religion and was the main reason we left to America. But that same impulse, the same passion she saw then, she's seeing now. She's just seeing that now, and she would say, you're asking good questions, you're thinking through big thoughts. And so for her, it just wasn't an issue, which again is heroic, is absolutely heroic. And I can fully admit that if the roles were reversed, I don't think I would have handled it with such grace. So then there were challenges, because then there are logistical problems. Where do our kids go to school? For me, it was very important that my kids didn't go to a school that taught them that their dad was wrong, or that their dad was, wicked, or I needed them. I was refusing that. But for Tova, it was I'm not going to not have my kids have a Jewish education. They're going to have a Jewish education. So that was an issue we had to figure out. We did, thank God there are schools in Israel that are called Yachad is one of them. Yachad, is entire function is to bring secular and religious kids together and teach them together, which necessitates a sort of open-mindedness on both sides. So we felt that was a good fit. That was one issue. Then it was how are we going to keep things in the home? Are they going to be kosher? Am I going to keep kosher? Am I going to keep kosher inside the house and outside the house, or just inside the house? Am I going to keep Shabbat? How are we going to do that? How are we going to teach our kids about this? And that was probably the hardest part, because again, practice and stuff, I was much more comfortable because I'd grown up keeping Shabbat. It wasn't hard for me to keep keeping Shabbat. That's not ultimately very hard. What was much more difficult was I don't want to hide from my kids. I don't want to lie to my kids. I actually knew someone in my community at the time when I was going through this who was going through the exact same thing. His take was basically to just put on a front for his kids. Totally lie. not share anything about how he feels, put on a full religious exterior so that his kids would never know. I think that's a bad take. My theory on parenting is basically you should never lie to your kids. I'm sure that someone could create a hypothetical, or I would agree you should lie to your kid. But for the vast majority of instances, I don't like lying to your kids. I don't like even the Santa Claus and Tooth Fairy stuff. I don't like that, because your kids are very vulnerable to a reality, and they want to learn from you the truth, and they expect to hear from you the truth. And you deciding to give them calculated answers because, they'll have fun, they'll love this, it's whimsical, or I feel too vulnerable to share this with them, I think that's unfair. And it will be very quickly, if they realize you're lying, it's very quickly realized, okay, so I can't trust what they're saying. They don't actually tell me their best approximation of truth. They tell me what they think I want to hear. Anyway, I'm sure there's good arguments on that people can have with me, but I hold by that. And this is how I felt with my religious journey, was I'm not going to lie to my kids. My kids will know that I don't believe in God. They will know that, but they'll also know that mommy does believe in God, and that's okay. And that both options are okay, and that ultimately they need to decide for themselves. And that it sounds really sweet, and I think it really is a powerful way to raise kids in some sense. And we're still trying to raise our kids with that, even though my wife and I are now on the same side in the religion-wise. But it also makes it very challenging, because Tova got the sense that she had to be careful with how she said God, because I didn't want her just saying to the kids, oh, we do this because God said so, because that implies that God is real. And if I not believe in God, then mom and dad are not on the same page, and mom knows something dad doesn't know, and now they have to start picking between us. So she had to use language that was more couched in like an openness, like, well, some people believe that God said this, or I live as if God said, very like complex ways of saying things, which is that's not easy. Kids need as simple as possible. But that's how we did things. And conversely, I would do the same thing on my end. I wouldn't say God doesn't exist. I would say, I don't think God exists, or I don't believe that God said that. So in some sense, it's a beautiful way to raise kids, but it's also not ideal. Really, ideally, you should be presenting kids with a worldview that both of you believe, but that is also across the board the same, as much as possible. Again, my wife and I, we got into a mode, and it's like a cute story we tell, was one day we were having a difficult discussion around our children and their education, and it was getting heated. And at some point in the conversation, in the now argument, we both realized that, because when you start having an argument with your wife, especially one that has to do with your kids, and that each person is not willing to move on, the word divorce echoes from somewhere, in the shadows. It's like whispered from there. And obviously we weren't close to that, but that's always on the mind of a married couple when they're having a fight that feels this big and important. And it was like both of us heard that whisper somewhere off in the darkness and made the realization that if we got divorced, even if we did, it wouldn't help us. We'd still have to have this exact argument about our kids' schooling. All we would do is be less happy now and apart. And it was like, oh, good. So we don't have to, we silenced that whisper forever. No matter how challenging the problem got, we knew it would not be made easier by a divorce. And we'd rather be in love and be together and have the great life that we're having. So why would we get divorced? That doesn't make any sense. It was like, it's nice for any couple that can banish that as a possibility. And that was for us okay, so we're committed to making this work, whatever it takes, and however weird our language has to be, and however much we have to explain and think through things and all that, we're going to make it work. And so, but again, you can think, okay, we got into a steady routine, me as an atheist, her as religious, us living a Jewish life, and then suddenly, now I'm starting to flirt with Christianity and move towards that, and that's a whole different bucket, because if you're an atheist, okay, you're not really trying to present a religion in the home. You're just a non-religion. Suddenly, if I would convert to Catholicism, well, how are we going to do it? Are the kids going to go to church with me sometimes? Are we going to have a Christmas tree? How are we going to do that? So we're back to having these discussions, but by this point, we had both matured, and so they were much simpler to have. We had already worked out so many things, and we knew how to communicate really well with each other. But again, there's Tova's heroism, because at no point did she say, this is crazy, don't do this. You're hurting our family. It's not fair to the kids. No point you said that. Again, it was the same refrain. If you're going after truth, go after it. We'll make it work. And in fact, when we moved here, I was super quiet about this journey. We would go to like our synagogue. I wouldn't tell anybody what I was moving towards. It was like a secret life that I was living. Tova was telling everybody because Tova was fully integrated with it, and like she was totally fine. Like, if this is what my husband's gonna do, this is what I'm gonna do. We're not gonna be ashamed of it. We're not gonna try to live. If no one's interested in that, we don't have to be friends with us. Like, she was way more comfortable with it even than I was at the time. And that's continued, and it continues to today. And even today, it's like Tova and I don't see eye to eye on every single thing, but we continue to work and have the same foundational trust in each other. And I give so much credit to Tova because there was this massive storm that formed right at the beginning of our marriage that could have knocked it off track. And I think for a lot of people it would have. And because she saw through all the externalities to the core, we were able to move past that and, back to smooth sailing. A common misconception that people have about God is that God is a magical amulet, is that God is something who's at your beck and call, who needs to be answering your prayers the way a vending machine takes your quarters. That prayer is me putting quarters into the vending machine, and then I press B9 and I want my pretzels. That's how people think their relationship with God is. And so they get disheartened when the things they're asking for every day don't come true. I think, and this is a very big concept, and I don't want to, I'm not speaking from a place of authority on this. Whenever we start to speak about God, we have to recognize we're going to be using a lot of metaphors and analogies to try to grasp what is ultimately ungraspable by the human mind. That said, I do believe God is a personal force. He has a relationship with us. But in that sentence, I just want to be clear, I just said he has a relationship with us. He there is just a placeholder. I'm not assuming God is a man. This is where, like, the language around God, we have to always be aware the fact that even the word God itself is a metaphor for something that the human language can't articulate. And I think the more we recognize that, the more we recognize what we're dealing with here. So I'll start to say things, but keep that whole disclaimer in mind about what we're talking about when we say God. And then we could talk about, which is I think a simpler topic, what's the purpose of prayer? God is the nature of all that is. God is God is isness. When Moshe asks God, what's your name? It's important, I think, to understand that when biblical characters ask the name for something, we have to look back at Adam HaRishon, the first man, who was given the responsibility to name all the animals. To name something is to categorize it, is to give it shape, form, put it in its box. This is really important when it comes to what we're doing in our day-to-day human life. Scientists need to name every single phenomena that they find, and as they break down that phenomena to its smaller parts, they need to name each part, because that's how we start to control and contain things. What happens when biblical characters start asking the names of angels or of God? They get kind of a backhanded response. When Jacob is wrestling the angel and asks his name, the angel asks him, why do you want to know my name? Almost defensively, right? What are you trying to do here? You trying to contain me? You're trying to take the infiniteness that is God and contain it into a little box for your mind that you can put on the shelf and know what it looks like and know how it feels and know what it's for? What are you doing? And when Moshe asks God's name, God says the cryptic answer, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, which is translated oftentimes as I am that I am, but a better translation probably, like grammatically in Hebrew, is I will be what I will be, or maybe I am being, or something like that. Something that cannot be defined. It's not unreal, it's the most real. It's super real. It's real beyond the categories that we like to place things on. So like something in Buddhist practice that they like to do in meditation is to look at a room, and as far as I know, I'm not an expert, but look at a room, and instead of seeing that's a tree, that's a chair, that's a picture, that's a lamp, just see it as an image. There's no difference. All that's happening here are a play of light and shadows that's creating these things, and then we have this mind that loves to stamp things on what they are, where they stop and end, right? But ultimately, there is no stopping and ending to these things. It's just where we decide where we live. We live in a space where we need to categorize these things, so we do that. But that's not the truest way of seeing reality. It's just a useful way of seeing reality. My analogy for this, which I love, is this wall next to us is a solid structure. And yet, science tells us it's mostly empty space. It's atoms bumping into each other, forming to our mind what becomes a structure, and yet we can't run through it. So it's true we can't run through this wall, but it's not the ultimate truth that this wall is a solid. So when we talk about what it is to connect with the infiniteness of being, it's to connect with, and this is where I'm going to jump a little bit, maybe without philosophically laying all the groundwork, to what I think is the transcendent spiritual truth, is that it is all love. That we're jumping into the ultimate love, that God is a loving being, a fully loving, creative being. But even by saying being, I'm limiting. So it's like I immediately have to catch myself and say, not quite a being, not something else. Not there's being and then there's God and then there's man. And he's over here and I'm over here and I pray to him and he comes to me, right? These are metaphors we use because they're useful. Metaphors. But that's not the way to understand it. Otherwise, just logically, God couldn't be all-powerful, because if he's an all-powerful finite force and you put a man, then he's slightly more powerful now because he's got the power of God and the power of a little man. But if God is infinite, without end and beginning, then doesn't end at my shoulder blade. That ultimately everything we're seeing is a manifestation of God. Now now we're in territory that's very hard to navigate. And there's all types of Kabbalistic ideas around Tzimtzum, a sort of self-void within God, almost like a womb, where finitude and evil can exist. So that choice can exist, that freedom can exist. And this is where we start to get to, why did God create the world? Another huge question that I can't answer authoritatively, but something I feel something that at least I connect to, even if it isn't a comprehensive answer, is God wanted to have a love affair with us. God wanted a being with which he could have a love affair. He can't have a love affair with someone that doesn't have freedom to decide not to have a love affair with him. He needed to create a void within himself, however we're supposed to understand a void within infinity, in which a being could be placed that had a neshama, a part of God within him, and yet would be in a world of where things are veiled over, where things are hard to see, where things are unclear, where evil can manifest. And only in that space can a person choose freely a relationship with God. And then God could satisfy this need that God had. Now again, I just said satisfy a need that God had, which is going to make a lot of theologians bristle, because how does God have need? Again, this is where we're no matter how much we talk about it, we unravel, our words start to unravel in front of us, because we can't possibly define the undefinable. So the best we can do is keep trying to talk about it, keep trying to think of analogies and metaphors that work. So one of the things we speak a lot in Jewish liturgy is God is king. I think people connect, especially people in America, connect less to that metaphor now than they used to. We have a sense of what it is to be around a king, and very reverent and powerful, but us Americans have a certain chip on our shoulder to the idea of kingship. We got rid of kings. So we almost I feel like that metaphor maybe doesn't hit as well. But now people are very comfortable saying God is Father. That feels very good. Or God is Mother. That also is very good. Right? God is Lover, I think, is where the mystics like to go. God is my lover. So all of that to say, what it is to have a relationship with God is to connect to the ultimate source of all being. It's to be able to have a sense of what's going on behind the veil. It's not to have a personal genie and a lamp who you can call on when you need help. So what is the point of prayer then? Why do we get up and pray? What's the point of it? If God is doing everything he needs to be doing, why are we praying? Again, there are so many good answers to this that are given over. I go between two, but the one that fits me most is that prayer is for us. It's a gift for us. We have an opportunity throughout the day to remind our selfish selves that we are not ultimately responsible for all the good in our life, that we are not the ones who are controlling everything, that we're not God, that we are in some sense a vulnerable being. When you say constantly to your wife or husband, I love you, you're not just doing something so you can make your marriage strong. You're also reminding yourself constantly throughout the day that this is a person you love. It's a constant, it pulls you away from it. It pulls you away from all your own distractions back into what you're trying to do, which is develop a relationship. Prayer is an opportunity to say, I love you too, to God. It's to take a second to realize, like, I have breath and life and goodness and friendships and all the great things in my life. And God gave me a will that's been able to deal with all different types of struggles. And I recognize that those struggles are making me a stronger person and giving me more of an ability to take on the world and live the most out of my life. And so all of this I'm deeply grateful for. And it's an opportunity to say, like, thank you, God. Thank you for that. And I think, and this is where we have to jump, when we ask for things in prayer, but there's two different types of prayer. There's gratitude prayer and there's supplication prayer. I'm asking for something. The formulation that you'll find in Jewish liturgy, I think, is really instructive, which is when we pray for things, we don't actually say, God, please give it to us. God, please give it to us, right? We instead say, God, who is the controller of the seasons and brings the weather, blessed are you, God, who brings the weather. Blessed are you, God, who revives the dead. Blessed are you, God, who forgives sins. In other words, we end off the prayer with an assumption that this is what God does. It's not what we hope God will do. It's what God does. Who are we reminding with that? We're reminding ourselves. We're reminding ourselves that we have the opportunity to live in communion with the ultimate ground of all being, and that ground of being is not an impersonal force, but a force that is intimately involved with our lives and loves us. And yes, is putting us through a struggle. It could have made it a lot easier. He could have made each of our individual lives a lot easier. He could have made this whole charade go away and we could all be angels, which are essentially something like, thought of as like a creation of God who is so in the face of God, in the presence of God, as to lack free will. They do God's bidding on earth. They're probably a necessary conduit between the transcendent level of God and our finite level. It's something like a connecting piece. But they don't get to have the love affair that we get to have with God, because we get to choose it amongst all the distractions. We get to choose it amongst all the struggles. So when we pray, I think of it much more. I want to be careful here because in our health and wellness culture now, it's very common to talk about praying as like either pray or meditate or take deep breaths. Like it's all for me. It's all about my relaxation. Like prayer is very relaxing. That's not what I mean by prayers for us. I don't think it's given to us just so we can relax our nervous system. If it does that as a byproduct, that is great. But it's also a very serious thing. We are communing with the infinite ground of all being. We really are stepping into a place of vulnerability and gratitude and love. And that's what I mean by it's for us. It's transformative of ourselves. It pulls us out. Now, I said there were two ways I kind of think about it. That's the one I'm like generally when I think of why I'm praying, that's generally why I'm praying. I'm also interested, there is people who talk about real things happening in the spiritual realms when prayer goes on. I struggle with that a little bit philosophically, but I think it's a cool idea to think about, that your prayer might actually be, drawing up. Again, one of the ideas in Jewish mysticism is this idea that when God made this void within himself to create us, this sort of sparks of holiness went everywhere and got stuck in the material world. And one of the things we could do by our acting out our religious practices is free those sparks and reunite them with the ultimate light. Now, I just said a bunch of words. I can't explain those, and I definitely couldn't philosophically explain them. I could barely understand them even as I say them. But the idea, I think, is a fun idea to think about, that prayer might be not just a self-exercise of transformation and vulnerability and gratitude, but actually might be doing something beyond that in a spiritual realm that we don't yet have an understanding of, and we can't see that big. And we're really part of this great spiritual adventure story where our spiritual practices help to draw the world back into the light of God, into its ultimate purpose. I'll leave that at the table because I certainly couldn't field a bunch of challenging questions about that. And I actually think beyond just I can't handle the questions, there's also real problems with this. I know there are a lot of people who pray for sick people. This is something very common. Someone's sick, we pray for them. And I think that practice is a really good practice. It connects us. It reminds us that there are people out there who are suffering and all that. But it's dangerous because if you start to think, hey, why is no one getting healed? I prayed, we got everyone together and we prayed for this person's cancer to be healed, and she died. How dare you, God? Again, I think we're starting with the wrong assumption. We're assuming that our prayers are somehow controlling God's plan, which puts us again in the driver's seat, and prayer is supposed to put us in the passenger seat. We're supposed to recognize that, no, okay, wait a minute. We give it all to God. So I think that's a challenge. And also there's a snarky atheist question of like, you'll see church groups get together to pray for someone's cancer to be healed, but you'll really never see them for someone's leg to grow back. In other words, where things can happen on their own, we can attribute that to miracles, but things that we know will never happen, we don't even pray for because that's outside of it. So again, there's somewhat of a danger of thinking that our prayers are somehow these super powerful, magical formulas that can like rearrange nature. But that's like where I'm at now. Ask me in a few years and I may have a different response. I saw something online once where it quotes the Buddha. Person came to the Buddha and said, I want happiness. And the Buddha said to him, I don't know if this is a true quote or not, but the Buddha said, remove I, that's ego. And then remove want, that's desire. And what are you left with? You're left with happiness. It's a beautiful story. It feels very nice. And I don't think there's anything, I think there's truth within that that's really valuable. But in my opinion, we can overdo this being content with what we have. I don't think God put us here to be content with what we have. If God wanted us to be content with what we have, he could have left us in Gan Eden. He could have left us in some spiritual state where we sit in perfect repose of the infinite. The Jewish religion says that God put us here for a reason. There's work to be done here. There's a mission that only you could do. There's a beautiful line by Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, that the day you were born was the day the world could no longer go on without you. Awesome line. Bishvili nivra olam. Right? That's what the rabbis say. Every Jew, every person must walk around and say, the world was created for me. The whole world was created for me. All of destiny is because I have to do something here. And that means getting our hands dirty. And that means not being content. If you're content, look at the Jewish prophets. We spoke about them earlier. The Jewish prophets are not people who sit around in contentment on the mountain. They feel a great urgency. They have to go and change people's ways. Real things are happening. They really need to make change. And they spent their lives yelling. They were not good. Most of them were not good lives. They were not people who sat on mountaintops thinking about the infinite. They were people who got into the muck and mire of their time and did the best they could to reform people's ways. I believe that when we have a desire, a specific desire, you mentioned, I think it's really cool because I think your desires can help you recognize where God wants you to go. So someone can have a great desire to make a lot of money. They may be the one that needs to go make a lot of money. Their destiny may be that they need to make lots of wealth because they're going to become great philanthropists. They're going to support communities of people and they're going to help end hunger. And they're and that's why God gave them a drive that doesn't exist in some other people. Some people have a drive, they want to build a huge family. It's all they want is a huge family. Good. That's awesome. Now, desires are fire, and like all fire, they need to be refined. If you let your passion, because you have this deep, you have deep sexual desires, and this is what the Jewish mystics talk about, sexual desire. Pay attention to it. Find the godliness in your sexual desire. In your passionate sexual desire, find the godliness there. Because God's directing you with that. He's given you that, but it's a massive fire, so you got to learn to refine it, or it can become extremely destructive. And so desire, the way I see it, and I think I can say that the way Judaism sees desire is not that desire is bad or should be flushed out and contentment should rule. I think desire needs to be properly honed and refined, which is why we have a Jewish life that does have all of these strictures and guards and guidelines, because it recognizes in order to properly channel all of this human energy in the right direction, you need proper guardrails. You can't just run wild and follow your whimsy because that won't work. Because desire is not desire, like any fire, is not properly oriented until it is. So for me, understanding the desires you have is a way of getting towards a knowing of yourself, and maybe a knowing of what God wants from you. And you can start to actually move in that direction in a way that, which is the Jewish mission, is to elevate the things around us. So to take the mundane and make it holy, to sanctify the 6 days of the week with Shabbat. That's the Jewish motto, I would say, is go into the dirt and sanctify it. Go into the world and sanctify it. So I wrote this book last year. It's called God-Shaped Whole. It's a collection of poems about my spiritual journey that start off when I was just beginning my atheism, the painful parts of atheism. It moves up into my sort of theophany, like the experience of God that I had. It speaks about that. It talks about the chaos in that, and then it moves towards it. There's some poems that deal with my flirting and moving towards Christianity. I actually had a former Christian read the book, and she immediately could pick up all of the allusions to Christian theology that are like sprinkled into some of the poems. And then it ultimately ends with a recommitment to Judaism. I will say, though, as you can already tell, my journey is very much an ongoing process, and I think at this point there is a bunch of poems that would need to be added on at the other side, because where I ended off in that book was more of all these religions I think are somewhat pointing towards the truth, and I've just sort of picked Judaism because it's the simplest. My commitment to Judaism, I think, is deeper now. It's more of a real commitment to this way of life. I don't know. I think all religions have their truth and their value, but Judaism continues to impress me with both its philosophical foundation and what its mystics talk about, and the way that it organizes everyday life and the type of things it focuses on. It suits me very well, and I think is a good contender for real truth. So that's where I would, maybe the book ends off maybe a little bit earlier on, where I was sort of still, I wouldn't say waffling, but comfortably within Judaism, but also very comfortable with all of their faiths. And while I still love to read the poetry and the writings of people from other faiths and find them deeply moving and deeply godly and holy, I have really more and more becoming attached to Judaism as, I think, a true path.
We'll do the follow-up interview in a year, see what happens.
Heck yeah. I might be a Muslim by then.
Awesome. Thank you for watching this episode of Still Seeking. There'll be more episodes posted in the future, and if you want to get notifications, you can hit the bell button and subscribe.